In 1620, while the Mayflower was in Provincetown, 18 of its men sailed in a small shallop, searching for a place to live. They came to present-day Eastham, where they were met by a group of Nauset. After a brief but violent encounter, the English left towards today's Plymouth. In 2020, we remember this first encounter. We explore its meanings for today and tomorrow.
Good evening. Welcome to our Sunset Series. Tonight we have with us Gene Toland, who lives in Eastham, and since 1964 he has served as a Maryknoll priest for many of those years in Bolivia. Thank you for being with us.
Well, good evening. I'm glad to be with you this evening, those of you who are either residents or are vacationing for a few days here on Cape Cod. As Tom mentioned, I spent much of my missionary career in Bolivia. And in the 1970s, when I first arrived in the Altiplano of Bolivia, about 14,000 feet above sea level, I wondered why and how people continued to live there over centuries. Everything, it seems to me, was extra hard. Farming, enduring the altitude, the cold, few health and educational facilities, and for me at least, a language with gutturals harsher than German. But as I grew to know and love the indigenous people of the Aymara culture, I learned how their natural resilience in face of harsh and demanding situations had carried them through. This, despite the cruelty of the Spanish conquest, the enslavement of the colonial period with land taken from them, forced to labor in mines as work animals, and being constantly relegated to a category of subhuman by dominating powers. Yet they survived and did so as a people. I was amazed in going deeper into the history of those lands how, even though the domination and colonialization endured over centuries, there had been numerous occasions when the people rose up to rebel and throw off the oppression. Generation after generation would say no to unjust laws and structures intended to keep them down as slaves and peons and to wipe out their culture. Even when the invading forces of colonial powers imposed a religion and tried to wipe out ancient rituals based on a cosmology that tied people to the earth as a mother, there was resistance that, in time, took the form of integration of Christianity into their own deep-rooted beliefs and practices. Their resilience created a sense of mutuality of respect between two religious systems, something that we Christians have only recently come to appreciate. In recent years, the political climate changed and allowed indigenous people of Bolivia to assume actual power in the country. With that change, ancient rituals and practices now took place in official spaces and were given recognition as legitimate and valuable expressions of the original peoples of the land. In a sense, they proclaimed what local tribal people here on Cape Cod shouted when told that they had disappeared. "We are still here. We never left." Today, we are witnessing here the proud resurgence by local, younger tribal members of indigenous cosmologies, rituals, ceremonies, dances, songs, and communal celebrations of solidarity. This in spite of persistent attitudes in our country to push tribal peoples and other people of color to the margins of society as second-class citizens, still occurring even today. What is the source of this resiliency that is so evident among indigenous peoples of all continents that I and my confreres and others have witnessed firsthand? I believe it is rooted in a hard, fast value expressed in the phrase, "I am because we are." That is, the individual exists only as part of a wider interconnected community of nature and extended family. No one faces hardship, sickness, and loss alone. You are always part of a people, and as such you are cared for by the people, and you bear responsibility for the well-being of the people. They have a deep sense of what we call the common good. Living for yourself is to cut yourself off from the umbilical cord of community support. Taking part in UN-sponsored forums on Indigenous rights, I was always deeply impressed at the immediate sense of community and solidarity that representatives from various Indigenous peoples from around the globe had for each other. They knew in their bones that they were related and interconnected and thus bound together in a common struggle for dignity and rights. For over 500 years, Indigenous people of the Amazon and across the Americas have faced invasions and loss of their ancestral territories, ethnic and social economic discrimination, and the constant threat of physical and cultural extermination resulting in displacement, disease, and even genocide. Now, Indigenous peoples, particularly those living in voluntary isolation, are gravely threatened by the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, a situation they share with brothers and sisters and sister Indigenous communities across the globe, and with Black and people of color in countries like the United States, who for decades and more have been deprived of supportive services of health care, education, and housing that was their right. Even so, without guidance and support from government public health agencies, many Indigenous organizations and peoples of the Amazon region are taking preventative measures on their own to stop the coronavirus from entering their communities. By voluntarily social distancing, using proactive hygiene practices, suspending major protests, events, and travel, closing traffic between villages, and controlling the entry or exit of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples into their territories, and producing, as well, public health communication materials in their own languages. Indigenous peoples across the region are now explicitly demanding that any and all outsiders refrain from traveling to Indigenous territories until further notice due to the current threats posed by the virus. Unfortunately, as in many instances, they are not being heeded, particularly by mining and lumber interests and mega agricultural interests. But they are hanging together despite needed resources to resist and live the resilience they have demonstrated for centuries. One cannot but compare this attitude with that of some people in our own country, including many young people, who ignore calls for protective measures against the spread of the virus for the common good of all. Indigenous communal resilience is a witness against lone wolf individual concern solely for one's own care and one's own comfort, with little sense of obligation to care for the wider community. That sense of resilience and of sticking together in adversity and crisis is also seen in communities of immigrants who are not that far removed from their Indigenous roots. It is notable how Hispanic communities in our country are more likely to self-monitor and care for each other during this pandemic as a community than we see in many other areas of the country. For millions of East Africans who eat only on days they can work, hunger is a daily problem that has become a crisis due to the pandemic, and hunger is rising to the level of starvation. Still, we are still seeing among them a commitment to taking seriously the communal nature of preventing the spread of the pandemic. Some sellers of food in open markets are sleeping in their stalls for days and weeks of social shutdown to prevent the spreading of the virus. As we face, all of us, an uncertain future in the coming weeks, months, and even years, we can draw on the wisdom of Indigenous peoples that gives them a strength of resilience despite lack of resources and support available to many of us. It is a resilience rooted in a sense of being interconnected and bonded in a common destiny with all of creation. It is a resilience expressed in solidarity and care for one another and the common good of all. This is something for us to keep in mind when calls for solidarity come from peoples of other lands in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia, even as we battle our situation of the virus. We are not alone in this, and together we can join our strengths to see us to safer grounds. So as we commemorate the encounter of Europeans with the original peoples of these lands, let us relive the mutuality of common concern that was offered by peoples of these lands to those who arrived from across the sea. It is a mutuality that shapes a shared resiliency that can see us through this pandemic and other dangers that threaten the common good of us all. In the words of our late brother, John Lewis, "Walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide." Thank you.